This is the story of our encounter with a potential killer. It was creepy in the sense that, at the time, we didn't know who we think we saw until months following. Alright, so I live in Canada for what it's worth to the viewers, and my friend and I were headed to his farm 80 kilometers north of Saskatoon to the middle of nowhere, essentially. We were on our way to Scare, his little brother and his friends who were camping the night out at the farm. The drive went great. I managed to sneak a road beer or two on the drive, and we discussed what exactly we were going to do once we got there. We finally arrive, and the first thing we notice is the front gate to the dirt road that leads to the entrance is wide open, which it's always supposed to be closed and locked. Whatever. Easily could have been forgotten, so we brush it off as forgetful teenagers. We then decided that it was probably the best idea to park the truck a distance away from the cabin so that they couldn't see us sneak up on them. Well, here's where things start to get a little creepy. As my friend and I start walking towards the cabin, we see what looks like a large figure, easily 6 foot tall, and he appears to be standing still having a smoke. Well, we think it's his brother's friend, so we decide to keep watching. After about 5 minutes, we just say fuck it and keep walking. All of a sudden, the silhouette of a man looks over at us briefly and starts booking it. We're pretty pissed that our plan failed, so we just rush to the cabin to alert everyone that we arrived. However, as we greeted everyone, we noticed all 3 of them were inside, and since all of them were inside, that means no one had been outside. Alright, so what the fuck, we swear we saw someone, a fairly large person actually. They immediately call bullshit and think we're scaring them, but we're serious. Anyways, the night progresses, we have some drinks and stuff, teenage shit essentially, and then we decide to leave. When we're about to leave, the generator outside cuts out, which it has never done before. Me and my friend immediately get chills, but again, his brother and friends think we're bullshitting and plan this all out, which now that I think about it is pretty ironic. So we go outside to investigate, a large bamboo stick in my hand, and my friend is wielding a hatchet. For whatever reason, we thought being armed was appropriate, although I think it paid off. The moment we step outside, we see a guy peeking through the garage windows, which is beside the door leading into the garage. We flip shit at him and then we charge him with the hatchet and the stick. He immediately dropped what looked like a lockpick or something and starts running into the black night and eventually into a thick bush and foresty area. We were all freaked the fuck out and left the farm in record time. Especially because it's the middle of nowhere and the closest neighbors are a few kilometers away. So now after all of this, fast forward 2 months and you have a husband charged with first-degree murder of his wife. He choked her to death, stuffed her in a storm drain, and tried lighting her body on fire to dispose of any evidence. The eerie part of the story? She was found no more than 2 kilometers away on a dirt road leading to the farm. And the body was found semi-burnt and decomposing for some time, meaning it could have been there for weeks or even months. I strongly believe the guy that we saw that night was the killer husband, especially because he was breaking into the garage where they kept gas and diesel, and because the generator ran out of gas randomly that same night. Makes me really think what would have happened had we not gone out there that night. Could 3 young teens have been murdered also? It could all be a coincidence too, but I strongly disagree with that. Anyways, it just goes to show that even when you're in remote areas, danger always seems to follow. When I was a boy, my parents used to take me and my older sister to my relative's house in eastern Kentucky, right around Letcher County. The closest city is Whitesburg. My uncle, who taught me everything I know about the outdoors, lived in a cabin nestled in a holler way back up in the mountains. His place was at the base of a big strip mine seam up on the mountainside. As a young boy, he and I used to sit out on his back porch at night and use predator calls to try and call something down out of the hills. Well, one night, he and I were out using one of his tapes. We'd been out there for a good 2 hours and had seen nothing, so we were thinking of calling it a night. We were about to pack everything up when he realized his squirrel feeder was empty. He then decided to go fill it back up with seed. His feeder was about 50 yards away from his cabin and on the mountainside that bordered the tree line. He walked up the hillside about 25 yards when his wife came out to see why we were still outside. The only light out that night was the light from his porch. He was about 35 yards up the hill and he called back and said that he forgot his flashlight, so his wife, aka my aunt, went back inside and got one of his spotlights. We had forgot to turn off the tape with the predator calls on it, so I reached down to the tape player to turn it off when I noticed my aunt was stiff as a board. I hit the off button and looked up at her and she had the spotlight shining straight up to the squirrel feeder where my uncle was at. I heard her say,
"It's coming toward you, Jim."
Jim is my uncle's name. He turns back and goes, "Huh?" Then a little louder that time, she says,
"It's coming straight toward you, Jim."
That's when I looked up and saw a set of eye shines about 15 feet away from where my uncle was standing and closing in. Whatever it was massive. The eyes were about 4 to 5 feet off the ground. Also, whatever that creature was, completely and totally got the drop on my uncle, who has pretty much spent his whole life in the woods studying and tracking predators. Well, he was turned around looking at us with his back to the woods, so we told him to freeze. We all just kind of stood there for about 3 minutes, which seemed like a lifetime. It was dead silent, no crickets, no sounds of the night. It was the most eerie and creepy 3 minutes of my entire life. It just sat there at the tree line staring at us all and us staring right back at it. The brush at the tree line was thick so we couldn't see what the shape of it was. Just the eyes and where they were in relation to the ground. After those 3 minutes, my uncle slowly turned around to see what was about 15 feet away from him. With our spotlight on it, as he was about to turn and look at it directly in the eyes, it split. And for the next 15 minutes, we could hear limbs cracking and snapping all the way up the side of the mountain as this animal decided to retreat. Scared the piss out of me and my uncle. Literally, my uncle pissed himself. I think that was the thing that scared me the most about it. It was that he was so scared. He was shaking and I had never seen him like that. The other thing that scared us both is that we had been sitting out there all night listening intently and watching that tree line like hawks. Whatever animal or creature it was did not make a single sound coming down the side of that mountain. It never made a sound until it took off. I didn't sleep that night, and neither did my aunt or uncle. This next story is not safe for work, so go to the description and click to the next story if you think you can't handle it. I'm a 33-year-old white female from Los Angeles. Yeah, I know, really convincing, right? 3 years ago, my boyfriend and I, as planned for 5 years, turned 30, sold everything we owned, including my car, took his Trailblazer and decided to just travel around the States and Canada. I guess you could call us backpackers, as we tend to chase good weather, find a state park, and backcountry hike into the wilderness for days at a time. My brother likes to joke that we are, quote, anti-establishment hippies. We don't necessarily live off the grid, but between the two of us we have one prepaid phone, which we use for emergencies or just checking in with family and friends, and one MacBook, which I use for work as I'm a freelance writer / content creator and I'm on retainer with a robotics company. I mostly write boring white papers or web content. The whole point of our living situation is to live debt-free and have as few bills as possible. I only use free Wi-Fi, so 1 to 2 times a week we have to go to a city with a Starbucks. This background info is only important so you know more about who we are and simply how we live. Neither of us is involved in social media and know very little of Reddit or Instagram or use any apps. Because, our phone isn't a smartphone. We don't even text. Alright, so on to it. Last summer we decided to do some backcountry hiking in Arkansas. It's one of those states you don't ever really hear about other hikers visiting, but we read that it had some beautiful natural landscape, and it does. The rules at this particular park were pretty lax. We didn't need a permit, there were a few basic laws and guidelines, but there was no check-in needed. We had all the basics and had planned to do a 6-day hike, 3 in, 3 out. The whole time we were out there, we didn't see or hear another soul, but on day 1, we were prepping to move off the trail and find a camping spot as it was getting near dusk. Half a mile off the trail is usually standard for us. We took what looked like kind of an animal trail, and about half a mile out we saw a green, 2-person tent. It was almost camouflaged in the foliage, so we kind of found it almost by accident. So some backpackers prefer privacy and others are more social. We're the more social type. We've had great experiences camping near other backpackers, sharing stories, food, and a joint or two. We were around 30 yards away from the tent, and it was zipped closed, so my boyfriend shouted a greeting to make our presence known. No movement, and no sound. We assumed green tent guy either wasn't around or didn't want to be bothered, so we started off in a new direction to get some distance between us. We camped, and we never heard a peep. We moved along the next morning, completely forgetting about green tent guy until nearing the end of day 5 on our trek back. We were, again, looking for a spot to camp off the trail when we came up on the green tent again. This isn't that unusual, but normally backcountry hikers keep moving, so we weren't really expecting it. The tent flap was open, so my boyfriend yells his greeting again, and nothing. My boyfriend wants to go check it out, saying it's weird and maybe someone is hurt, but I didn't really like the idea from the get-go. Because even though we hadn't had any bad experiences personally, we'd heard enough stories from other backpackers about hermits and mountain men that want privacy, carry guns, etc. But my boyfriend assured me we'd be fine, and if all else fails, offer him some weed to keep the peace and we'd go on our way. As soon as we get within 20 yards of the place, the smell of decomposition is intense. My boyfriend has been hailing his greeting over the last 20 yards, and once the smell hits him, he stops and turns to me and says, "What if we find a dead body?" My skin crawled. I was immediately afraid. I've never seen a dead body before, and I really don't want to. The closer we got to the tent, the worse the smell got. I knew for sure we were going to walk in and see some old camper's rotting corpse. What we found was worse than that. Outside the tent was a dead doe's legs, all 4 of them covered in flies. It looked like the legs had been cut most of the way and then ripped off the rest of the way. It was a mess. Inside was the body and head of the deer, but the middle portion was swaddled in a blue fleece blanket that was blood-soaked at the bottom where the legs used to be. It was laying on its side, bottom facing the tent entry. The tail had been cut off and the anus and vagina was covered in dried blood and agape, like something had been penetrating it. The same with its mouth. The bottom portion was bent down at a scary, broken-looking angle. The tent was open so we could see everything without having to go inside. Not that we would have anyway, because at this point the smell was almost debilitating. There was a dirty, almost empty clear bottle of Jergens baby oil and a stained green and white fringed kitchen towel. And that was all. I immediately started crying and begged him to go. All he could muster was, "What the fuck?" And we turned and ran. We ran to the trail and jogged down it as far as we could go until dusk was fully on us and we had to set up camp. We didn't go very far off the trail and neither of us slept. We didn't start a fire or use headlamps after dark, we just sat up whispering to each other, going over and over what we had just seen. Every little noise startled us. It was like our brains were on red alert. I kept thinking any moment a dead deer rapist would come back to his tent, see our footprints or something, know we were there and track us back to our tent. I've never been so scared in my entire life. Just before dawn, we tore down and started out. My boyfriend stopped at the ranger station on our way out of the park to report what we had seen. The ranger was a young guy around our age, and he looked as freaked out by our story as we were telling it. He wrote most of it down, and my boyfriend showed him on a map approximately where it had been. He asked if we knew how the deer had been killed, and at that point we hadn't even thought about it. We just assumed it had been shot, but because of the blanket we didn't see a wound. But we weren't exactly giving it an autopsy either. Since this, we shortened our backcountry hikes to a maximum of 4 days. We've also been a lot less eager to call out to other campsites. And we've never approached another unmanned tent again. When I was 20, my girlfriend at the time and I decided to take a week-long camping trip to some property that belonged to her father's friend. We brought my Australian cattle dog, Wrangler, and her German Shepherd, Zero. Where we were going was a 4,000-acre undeveloped ranch in the northeast Texas woods. The plan was to be taken, by four-wheeler, to a point on the property unknown by us, and then we would hike back to the main gate over the next week. I had a GPS for an emergency, but we planned on doing the trip with maps and compass only. We were well equipped for the trip, had enough food for 3 days as we planned to hunt for the rest, water for 3 days, and water purifying systems. We also had all the necessary camping gear, and she had her bolt-action 223 along with a Taurus Judge. I had my .22 rifle and my .40 cal Baby Eagle, so we were prepared to say the least. We arrived at our destination and bid farewell to the friends that dropped us off on the four-wheelers. Our first day, we mainly wandered around exploring and figuring out our plan. There was a creek running through the property that we could follow and it would get us pretty close to the gate. We had our plan and had done enough exploring, so we started setting up camp before it got dark. Our first night was very pleasant for the most part. We had dinner by the fire with the dogs chit-chatting all night till about midnight when we decided to turn in. I woke up around 2:30 with a strange feeling. I saw Zero and Wrangler at the door of the tent, very tense but not making a sound. I knew right away something wasn't right. Both of these dogs were very well trained and very loyal and protective of us. I stepped out with the light and the .40 to look around and left the dogs with my girlfriend just in case, as she's a deep sleeper. I made my rounds around camp and found nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I passed it off as maybe a pack of coyotes and went back to bed, trusting the dogs to watch out for us. We woke up the next morning and I told her what had happened. We just blew it off and began our day. Well, the second night we set up camp near the creek and things got a bit weird. While we were sitting around the fire, we heard a very strange sound, something I've never heard before. The dogs began to growl and snarl facing the woods north of us. We quickly drew arms and began to sweep the campsite. We found nothing, but the sound persisted around the camp. It was like a snarling, gargling, sniffling sound. We didn't sleep that night. No matter how much we looked and checked, we could never find the source of the sound, and the dogs were restless the whole night as well. By the third night, it was almost impossible to sleep. When night fell, we sat by the fire with arms at our sides. We were going to stay up in shifts to keep watch, just in case. While I was asleep, I heard the dogs go off, and when I woke up, I saw my girlfriend standing with her dog Zero at her feet and her Judge drawn. I quickly took arms at her back. Something had apparently ran very rapidly behind the tent. She couldn't describe what it was. Then it ran by again. I caught a glance under the light of the fire behind us. It was big and very fast. It ran on all fours, but that's all I made out. It sounded like more than one creature this time. They couldn't be coyotes, way too big and much too fast. She spotted one again behind the tent and fired. We heard the nasty snarl again and Wrangler broke away from me and gave chase. I love my dog but didn't dare go after him. I just called and called, but he didn't return. We stood there, guns drawn, for an hour after she had fired. Everything was quiet. Then we heard rustling. We had our sights on the sound and then Wrangler came out of the woods. He wasn't hurt, but he had blood on his back. After this, we decided to bug out at sunrise. We packed up and started hiking. We were about 2 days hike non-stop from the gate and we were ready to do it. The next night, we didn't camp. We instead broke out the headlights and kept going. Whatever was in those woods was back, following us, but at a greater distance this time. They followed all night. That was one of the most intense hikes I've ever had. We hiked with our guns in front and the dogs in back. Whatever was following us wasn't stupid. It stuck to our sides, usually about 40 yards out into the woods, always out of sight. We stopped for a few minutes to rest around 4 a.m., and they stopped too. From what we could hear, it sounded like maybe 3 things out there. They got closer when we stopped and I thought I saw something and I fired the 223. I didn't hit anything, probably my mind playing games with me, but the shot scared them back to a much greater distance. By sunrise, they were gone again. We made it to the gate before dark and hightailed it out of there. We returned the next day on 4-wheelers and with several other people to have a look around. We went to the site of our second camp and found a blood trail from whatever the hell my girlfriend had hit with the slug shot loaded in the Judge. The trail ran for about 200 yards before we lost it. We found nothing else and headed back before darkness caught us again. We never found out what they were, and no one had ever experienced anything like that on the property before. To this day, I try not to talk about it too much because I even have trouble believing it sometimes. I try to tell myself they were coyotes with mange or mutated or something, but my girlfriend at the time never let me believe myself. Not too many creatures out there can take a 410 slug and bleed that much without going down, especially not a coyote. All I know is that I won't camp on that property anytime soon.